I'm Dr. John Salen, the Director of Cyber Solutions for Defense at GDIT, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar series, Enabling Next Generation Military Technology, with the first edition on ICAM, sponsored by GDIT. Before we begin, we'd like you to answer a few polling questions so our speakers can fine-tune their remarks. Please indicate your choices on the following questions, and we'll get started shortly. Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections, since we're recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Network. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Tom Temin, the host of Federal Drive on Federal News Network.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. And before we get to our guest today, I just want to remind everyone this is the first of 3 panels that we'll be bringing to you in the next couple of months. Later on, we will be talking about Mission Partner Environment Networking, MPE, and after that, 5G. My guests today are Jay Bonsi, the Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force. Commander Jonathan White is the Cloud and Data Branch Chief for the U.S. Coast Guard. Colonel Ray Gerber is the Assistant Chief of Staff for the Pacific Marine Forces, G6, G39. Drew Malloy is Cybersecurity and Analysis Technical Directorate at the Defense Information Systems Agency, and Dr. John Salen, Director of Cyber Solutions for Defense at GDIT. Today we're talking about ICAM, Identity and Credential and Access Management, which is basic to pretty much everything that's going on across DoD networks, and the Coast Guard, which I guess we can consider the 5th or 6th. Every few years, there's another branch of the military. Interesting, now you hear guardians coming into the parlance along with, soldiers, sailors, Air Force, and Marines. And now we have the guardians. But let's begin with just an outline of what is going on in ICAM. What does your basic setup look like? And then later on, as we get through the discussion, we'll continue with how it's extended to non-person things and generally how you'll maintain that security and expansion of it as we go forward with projects like JADC2. So, Jay Bonsi, let's start with you.
All right, thanks, Tom. The identity ecosystem in the Air Force is kind of grew up organically over the last decade. And we see ICAM solution sets attached to various communities. And so we have, for instance, we have an ICAM solution that powers our cloud instance in Cloud One. We have another community for A1, really focused on our retirees and beneficiaries, so non-CAC eligible people who need to interact with the Air Force. We also have identity solutions in our DevSecOps space. We have an identity solution that we recently migrated to GFUD, provided by DISA, that powers our Microsoft Office 365 installation. And so we're looking at this very broad solution space across numerous classification levels and across other areas for where we're the executive agent, for where we provide to joint provider spaces. And we're looking to kind of really consolidate those under one larger enterprise, sort of as a service solution, as well as a consistent point solution for where we need to have deployed or disadvantaged connectivity solutions.
And does that idea of at a service also relate to the need for some automation and the administration of all of this as many things are brought together?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So what we need to provide as a service is really a consistent baseline of identity stores, where that comes in from, sort of DMDC or other key canonical sources, as well as, our Air Force personnel offices. And so we need to have that. We need to have our automated identity and attribute management elements, whether or not that is automating a 2875 or other workflows for sort of joiner lever problems, or to be able to do sort of the end state nirvana, which is a sort of standardized federated attribute store across defense partners so that we get a flat and consistent directory so that you can take, that common access card, that common credential that we all have, which is a tremendous baseline, and be able to take that to any mission set, whether or not it's joint, whether or not it's international, whether or not it's the PIV standard and we're interacting with state or justice or other types of partners, and be able to have relatively consistent access to Air Force systems. And that requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of coordination, but we're making pretty solid strides this year to get after that.
All right. Well, let's move on to one of those military partners. Let's move to Colonel Gerber from the Marine Corps. What's going on with ICAM there? And it sounds like there's some federation going on here, given that you are in the Pacific region in your area of operations.
To a degree, I think it's important to note that my role as a Marine component here underneath INDOPACOM means that I have equities similar to what Jay just talked about from a service perspective. And I take my guidance and direction from the Marine Corps of Service and the Department of the Navy, working underneath the joint umbrella. And so, ironically, most of my commentary in terms of what we're doing from a service perspective would fall largely in line with where Jay is and with what Jay talked about. Then you get to the other side of it, being an assigned and allocated component to INDOPACOM, potentially unique on this panel, means that my application of this is inherently, particularly as it relates to the Marine Corps, tactical in application as it relates to current operations. And so the tension on our end, to kind of wrap up my commentary on that, is the Marine Corps admittedly is doing more what I would consider identity and access management, IDAM, vice identity, credential, and access management. We're in a period of transition, admittedly, right now, moving towards what Jay described as that future where you have the ability to work across the joint environment with a, basically you fall back to that idea of your CAC, but now virtual provides you this persistent persona throughout your tenure that adds or detracts from what your accesses are across classification means. We're not there yet, but you can see the potential of it, but it requires a significant paradigm shift. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that we're sitting in the middle of that paradigm shift. And like any transition, you're sitting in the middle of it with a lot of friction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And that idea of the persona changing and morphing as roles and responsibilities change right now, that's a difficult thing to effectuate in any kind of automated way, I imagine. Absolutely.
It inherently becomes bureaucratized. And once you're established, it's very efficient. It's the matter of becoming established. One of the potentials that ICAM has that would be of near and dear to anybody that served in and around the DoD is you could have a single SAR, system access and authorization request, that goes across all the different networks that you have. For example, that alone might be worth all the effort that we're putting into this.
All right, good. And we'll get more on that as we move through the conversation. I want to move to Commander White from the Coast Guard. And again, you've got the DHS piece that you're part of, but then you also have the military support as you operate also, people don't realize, around the world as well.
Yes, Tom. Coast Guard's in a rather unique situation where we have to both interoperate with our DoD mission partners and also our DHS mission partners at the same time. And if people don't know that we're actually operating on a DoD network, our network is 100% secured and connected to our DoD infrastructure, and all of our ICAM systems fall under the DoD systems. However, we also need to provide access to DHS mission partners, share data with DHS mission partners, and be cognizant that we have multiple statutory authorities, including we're primarily a law enforcement agency, which can conflict sometimes with our military obligations as well, and data sharing. And so right now our ICAM infrastructure is split between being on-prem or a tactical deployment on our cutters and our aircraft, and in our cloud environment. We did our migration to the DISA GDS service, so we are using that as our authentication piece for our Microsoft 365 environment. And we also have to provide an ICAM solution for our assets that are floating around in the ocean. And sometimes they can be disconnected for over 30 days at a time, especially if you consider our polar icebreakers. They go north and south, and there's very little satellite connectivity there. So we definitely have the unique scenario where we need to sort of download our ICAM package to those assets and be able to make it available and keep a robust security architecture as well.
Yeah, I'm hearing the theme. There's a need for sort of an inside-outside type of integration or enterprise business and tactical integration for there to be a kind of a unified approach across this. And this is what people are working at. Let's move on to DISA. Drew, I think of you as maybe the central holder of a lot of this capability for the military.
Yeah, I think for us, we come at it from an enterprise service provider perspective. So we're looking more at the enterprise use cases. A number of the panelists have said that they've integrated with what we have for our global directory support for Office 365. We have brought them onto actually a number of different applications. I think we're up to 150 so far. But really, when we talk about service specific and tactical edge, that's where we need to explore the federated use case and get towards, one, how do we federate from an identity perspective, and how do we federate from an attribute perspective? Because there's only a limited amount of attributes that we have as a department at the enterprise level. And a lot of the specifics around when you want to get towards automating, like Jay said, the 2875, you're going to need things like supervisor information. Well, that's really going to be specific HR systems within the services or agencies themselves. There's not really going to be that overall, DoD level system. Or as I say, if your role is changing, that's not going to be tracked at an enterprise level. That's most likely going to be something that we need to get that information from local systems and then federate that so that we can provide, the best identity solution possible.
Well, the challenge I'm hearing emerging, and I'm going to ask Dr. Salen to comment on this, is in many ways the getting to that universal and extensible and configurable approach to entities on your network is in some sense a data issue. But tell us more. What do you see from looking across government here?
It is very much a data issue. Thanks for that comment, Tom, because the challenge isn't so much to establish a universal identity, but to really have more like a universal translator. For fans of Douglas Adams, a Babelfish, right? So I can translate my identity to whomever I need when it's tactically relevant. And I think that what we've heard from all of the services in particular is this challenge of working in the tactical environment, but also interoperating with the enterprise. My background is actually designing tactical systems. I started designing networks for ships and for embarked marine units and embarked staffs. And that challenge of constantly moving back and forth from the enterprise environment to the tactical environment causes some organizational friction. So having a solid data management strategy and understanding which of those attributes, as Drew was mentioning, that you need to maintain at the enterprise level, that makes sense at the enterprise level, but then having an extensible data fabric that allows the tactical commanders, when they have to operate independently, to be able to say, all right, these 5 attributes make sense at the global level, but I need these 3 other attributes to associate with identity in order to make my mission make sense. And that's really the key to this federation concept. It allows us to authenticate globally, but really to control access and share access locally. And it gives, that's the key to all of this. And it does boil down to how are we managing the data, like you had said.
And let me ask you this, and we'll, kind of go to the military folks one more time. There is interaction between man and machine, if you will, in a tactical situation. And as machines get more networked and they might get I don't know, I'm just making this up, but targeting or terrain or some type of information from the network, the person associated with that, say the authority to fire, for example, it seems to be you have to have a matchup almost of identities and privileges between human being and machine. Is that a fair way to put it?
That is absolutely a fair way to put it, and even to take it out of the the scenario of firing authorizations and putting into something more basic, sensor data. Understanding that I'm going to make decisions on information that I'm collecting from sensors that I may or may not have any understanding for or had planned for previously. They happen to be available, and I make a decision whether I'm going to accept and use that sensor in this mission environment. That boils down to the kinds of attributes that we can assign to it, including some degree of trust. To what level do I trust that this sensor is what it presents itself as in an integrity level, just like I would as a person-based entity? And I can make those determinations based on who they say they are, how they're presenting, and then how they're behaving. And that's really critical.
Jay Bonsi, can you comment further?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so there are a lot of great opportunities here when we talk about non-person entities and how we develop the attributes for them. We tend to look at this problem set really from a risk lens, right? Which is perhaps another way of saying what John was outlining, which is to say, how do we make a risk decision around the way in which the patterns of your non-person entity works, right? And both for non-person and for person entities, right? So we're on this sort of maturity curve right now where we are kind of up-leveling our person entities and really trying to find our clarifying use cases for those non-person entities, whether or not it is sensor data, whether or not it is simple API or scripting, whether or not it's people who are interacting with your data fabric, or whether or not it is truly autonomous systems doing autonomous things, and how to integrate that with a common cyber picture so that you can understand when your network is performing automated tasks on the way to autonomous tasks, and to think about those things as two separate steps along a maturity model. So we're wrestling right now with those clarifying use cases. There are clearly non-person entities today. A lot of it is baked into Active Directory, and a lot of the challenges that we have in moving towards this future is moving away from some of the legacy limitations of traditional very large Active Directory deployments, and to think about it, as John said, more as a data problem that we can then rehydrate across a data fabric and get attributes where they need to be when they need to be there.
All right, we're going to keep pulling on this thread, but right now we're going to take a short break. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This panel discussion is Enabling Next Generation Military Technology series, our first edition being on ICAM, sponsored by GDIT here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to our panel discussion, Enabling Next Generation Military Technology series, the first one being on ICAM, sponsored by GDIT here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Jay Bonsi, the Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force, Commander Jonathan White, the Cloud and Data Branch Chief for the U.S. Coast Guard, Colonel Ray Gerber is the Assistant Chief of Staff G6 and G39 for the Pacific Marine Forces, Drew Malloy is Cybersecurity and Analysis Technical Directorate at the Defense Information Systems Agency, and Dr. John Salen, Director of Cyber Solutions for Defense at GDIT. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were talking about this idea of integrating identity and credentialing and access management for people and the machines that are associated with them in the field, mainly in the tactical, but I guess not exclusively in the tactical. So Colonel Gerber, tell us more about how you are looking at that situation where things have to be authenticated and so on, along with the people associated with them.
So I think my commentary would segue from where John started and then Jay took us and say, we look at it much the same as Jay described in terms of the risk, but I would highlight the opportunity there. When you think about a data-centric or common data framework environment where, for example, we talked about sensors previously, and that's what I would hone in on, because a Marine contribution to the joint force may be forward deployed sensors on very low bandwidth connections. So this machine-to-machine communication, which is inherently more reliable in many ways than person-to-person, also significantly faster, consuming less bandwidth, then puts you back into a larger data environment where you can make an assessment, as described by Jay and to a degree by John, about whether or not and how much you trust that. The other thing the Marine Corps is doing right now that Jay mentioned that I think we would highlight is becoming familiar with what is the norms of what your data looks like as it's processing is an inherent part of how you build out what eventually be AI driven. But this is the simple data collection and data analysis that's often manually intensive that's being done time now, but it provides the eventual algorithms to allow you to determine if I don't trust this data anymore because it is abnormal. And so I guess I would harp on the idea that machine-to-machine communication with with a common data framework, in our minds, from a Marine Corps perspective, akin to where the Coast Guard went in the previous part of the discussion about being disaggregated and a long ways away from high bandwidth, is a place where we're spending a lot of time because it has the most opportunity for us to contribute back to the joint force.
All right. Does that sound about like your situation, Jonathan?
It does, and I'd like to highlight two main issues that we're seeing emerge from this, especially when you go down the zero trust journey. As you see more and more control of your enterprise to automation and to scripting and to tools that are out there, each one of those scripts really, they need to identify themselves and be able to be controlled from a cybersecurity standpoint. I should be able to shut down a Scripps account just as much as I would shut down, a nefarious actor or somebody whose credentials have been stolen. I think it's very important that as we go down this road, we really treat these entities as not necessarily non-person entities, but as a critical component of your infrastructure. The other problem that I'm facing as we theorize, as we go down this road, is data quality and knowing, the provenance of that data. Where is it coming from? What's the authority of that sensor to actually provide that information into the data fabric or the data mesh that you're building? And as it matriculates up through the enterprise and gets aggregated, we're making decisions on that information. We should be able to, point back to exactly where that came from and the authority that was provided by.
Yeah, Drew, that's a good point. The idea of, we were talking about machinery or physical sensors, but software is another whole branch of thing that needs to, as Commander White said, be identified, especially, in containerized environments, which you're seeing more of in the DISA clouds and so forth. Container pairs, they need to be verified from one another, or otherwise you could inject something malicious without knowing it, without having that visibility into it. So maybe discuss the idea of the software agent, the RPA algorithm, whatever it might be, as being part of this whole complex for ICAM.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the non-person entity use case is really ubiquitous from the enterprise all the way down to the tactical scenario, from the sensor shooter perspective up to, like you touched on, machine-to-machine communications, authenticating those. If you want to develop towards really an API-based infrastructure, and you want to rely on the integrity of those machine-to-machine communications, we really have to think about how we are doing NPE within our credentialing program and how we get to more automation. Automation is really going to be one thing that is going to spur us to make sure that we are rotating these certificates often, that we are, validating their integrity, things of that nature. It's going to be a big problem, and for us, having the DoD PKI program underneath our directorate, it's something that we are looking towards as we modernize.
Right. So, John, then does this back up to the DevSecOps environment at some point, where somehow these attributes need to be inherited by what it is you deploy later on.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And the point that Drew made about automation being the key to effecting all of this is absolutely dead on. But I would add to that, the automation should have some degree of explainability. Showing your work, just like when we were in grade school, you didn't get full credit for the answer just by getting it right. You had to show your work and how you got there. And I think that's where it's critical for this automation to roll into the DevSecOps process. Because if we understand algorithmically how the automation is expecting to use those attributes, we can better inject those attributes and understanding of how to pass those attributes in the DevSecOps process and really shift all of this concept as far left as possible. And this is really how we move from trying to secure an environment to building a secure environment. And it really is the core of secure engineering and the sec part of DevSecOps.
And I'm going to ask our military folks just one more question. There's another vector yet again, and this has been made apparent by the news lately, and where the United States is conducting joint exercises with allied partners. Some of our unallied semi-partners don't like it very much, but there is the need for jointness with those partners, which means, once again, people are together in this whole environment. And Colonel Gerber, how does that affect the equation for ICAM and access to resource? We're really talking about access to resources more than ICAM itself in some sense.
So absolutely, it adds a layer of complexity that I believe my colleagues spend a lot of time dwelling on, because it's hard enough to do internal to your specific entity. You add complexity to it when you go joint and then interagency within the United States. Adding in a coalition or combined framework to make it a mission partner environment is a significant challenge, and yet it's incredibly imperative work. Spent a lot of time here at MAR4 PAC, Marine Forces Pacific, working with key partners and allies and trying to find ways to share as much data as possible. And the gold standard of it comes back to the refrain that I had earlier, which is if you can sidestep you can get to the machine to machine. So you're sharing a common operational picture or a common intelligence picture or targeting data or sense of data. That is the gold standard, but it's often very difficult to do just based off of different nations' ways of creating their data frameworks. And so as you see, the direction that we're heading is trying to find the technical solutions to it, but ironically, a lot of it comes back to what we're also finding is in the interim, just put people in the appropriate locations and find ways to share the data there. And so ironically, while this is a technical panel, sometimes the best solution for it is actually a U.S. person with U.S. Equipment right there beside a partner nation, and you've achieved the interoperability you might need at the time. It's not the standard we want to achieve, it's the standard we start with for now. As we move towards finding more technical solutions, for example, a one-way data flow or a limited scale of how much we share. I'm not sure that really answers your question, because I'm not sure I have a great answer to that question, even though I get asked it every day.
Well, sure. Then you still, to some degree, rely on knapsack net, we might call it, or backpack net type of interaction there, or boot net, whatever. There's a million words you could use. And Jay, in the Air Force, many of the partners are using the same planes and so forth. So there's some commonality there to begin with. I think like Norway, do they have an Air Force?
We have a lot of NPE elements in the Air Force. I mean, we do have common partners on those platforms in Joint Strike Fighter, and there is a certain set of mission partner challenges there inside of that program. But we're also the executive agent for inside the Mission Partners Capabilities Office, where we're really looking at this problem. And the future of coalition data sharing is zero trust, right? We are allies with partners who are not allies themselves, and so we have a very specific challenge of being able to share an almost unlimited quantity of data to a very large and complex web of partners. And so we have to think about the networking standards. We have to think about the workload hosting standards. We have to think about, how do we leverage our investments in cloud to be able to handle that collaboration and to be able to accelerate it. But really the end goal there, to kind of Colonel Gerber's point, is the gold standard is we need to be able to share information when we need to share it at the time of need. And we're spending a lot of time really thinking about how do we get the scaling ready for those scenarios so that we are not limited by the pipes that we have or the compute that we've bought, but we are sort of only limited by our imagination and our ability to get the paperwork signed to do that sharing. And so it's a big challenge. There are a lot of components to it, and it is something that we are actively working through both the policy and the kind of international affairs elements of today.
Yeah, Commander White, how does that work with the Coast Guard? Because again, I emphasize people often don't realize that the Coast Guard is international in many of its operations. It's not just, the U.S. coast itself and local boaters and that kind of thing.
That's correct. We operate all around the world. We have presence everywhere. We do overseas deployments, to the East Pac and to other locations. And typically when we talk about international data sharing for the Coast Guard, we're operating through DoD systems like Centrix, for example, or some other Navy platform perhaps that we're working on, or direct VHF communication with another vessel, right? So if we're going to board another vessel that's a different flag, we would communicate with them, and on shore we would have communication between embassies and headquarters entities, right? I can't really speak to our robust data sharing with international partners, but I would say a corollary to that is our sharing with the industry partners we have, right? So the maritime transportation sector is a huge partner for the Coast Guard. Our vessel traffic systems that regulate our ports, we ingest a ton of information that when vessels come in, they provide their arrival notification. We check that against various databases. And it's, a lot of that is an interplay between Coast Guard and industry trying to keep the smooth flow of commerce throughout the entire nation. And I could say pointedly, our cybersecurity teams, they actively go out and engage with our port partners and work with them to help improve their cybersecurity posture as well. So that is probably more aligned with what the Coast Guard is doing on a daily basis today. Certainly would be a broadening to have more international data sharing as well.
Yeah, and Drew, just tell us the extent to what this data sharing looks like, because it sounds like the provenance of the data really is crucial to be able to rely on it, especially if you have a zero trust type of aspiration there.
Yeah, absolutely. The data question gets really tricky really quick. So for us, as Jay mentioned, he's spot on. The move to zero trust is really going to be the answer for this, but it's going to take graduated steps to get there. Identity is definitely one of those key steps. And then when it comes to network access to applications and then access to data, I think the big challenge that we have is one on the identity side, working with all of our mission partners and coming to agreement on what the right MFA approach is, be it like Jay said, the PIV standard, other international standards, something of that nature, and then how do we trust that is the actual person? And then on the data side, we need to get better within the DoD at tagging our data in order to automate those security controls so that we can get the data at the time of need to where it needs to be. We can bring automation into it to say, you are allowed to see this data for X amount of time, right? Or turn it on and off and not have to manually do that, which is unfortunately a lot of the way that's performed today in a mission partner environment.
All right. And I want to return to the topic after we take a short break here of the idea of that industry and government data sharing, because that takes us into a lot of interesting areas. And John will start off with you when we do return. But right now, we're going to take a short break. I'm Tom Temin. This panel discussion is Enabling Next Generation Military Technology, the first in a series starting with ICAM, sponsored by GDIT here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to our panel discussion, Enabling Next Generation Military Technology. This is the first in a series, and we're starting with ICAM, all sponsored by GDIT here on Federal News Network. My guest today, R.J. Bonsi, the Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force. Commander Jonathan White is the Cloud and Data Branch Chief for the U.S. Coast Guard. Colonel Ray Gerber, the Assistant Chief of Staff G6, G39 for the Pacific Marine Forces. Drew Malloy is the Cybersecurity and Analytics Technical Directorate member from the Defense Information Systems Agency. And Dr. John Salen, Director of Cyber Solutions for Defense at GDIT. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before the break, we were thinking about the issue of, well, we talked about a lot of data sharing and the need for ICAM across things, across foreign partners. And then there is also the huge interdependence of military operations and industry. And you have both, again, data, machinery, and human beings that are interacting side by side in that whole, that's the way the world really is. So maybe, John, tell us what are some of the challenges there for this ICAM extensibility and federation challenge as industry and the military go forward.
So, as we look at the complexity of data sharing in this ecosystem environment of industry, military, coalition forces, interagency operations, as Commander White was talking about with the Coast Guard mission in particular, this really underscores a point Jay made about zero trust being the key to all of this. We started out talking about ICAM, and really ICAM and zero trust, I view those as two sides of the same coin, because there's this spectrum of managing identity and the credentials to provide access to data and services, and then moving into some of the more complex and some of the more advanced features of making risk adaptive decisions on access control, deciding how and when, temporal access control to provide resources. And all of this reminds me of a program I used to work on previously. It was a co-development program where we had contractors like myself working in support of the U.S. Navy in this case, but we also had foreign governments, foreign militaries participating in the same development environment. It was a very technical environment too. So we would have, U.S. Navy officers, contractors, and then 3 or 4 different foreign military officers all sitting in the same room, sometimes sharing technical information about the design of a system. And the data sharing aspect of it was very difficult for us from a technical perspective, right? There were all of the processes and procedures that we had to follow to say, okay, this bit of information is secret but releasable only to U.S. persons. This is releasable to, say country A. This is releasable to country B, but not A, right? And that's hard enough to do in a conversation. Trying to do that in a data management perspective is an absolute nightmare. And what we usually defaulted to was having 4 or 5 separate documents of the same design, of the same complex technical design, one for US persons, one for country A, one for country B, one for country C. And that in turn actually reduced our overall security of our data because we ran into a configuration management problem, which would inevitably happen. I would make a change in one document and perhaps forget to flow the appropriate changes to the others.
Sure.
But in a zero trust environment where we can start to make risk adaptive or attribute based decisions on giving access to portions of tagged data, we can now have a single authoritative source of truth and then provide access dynamically based on things like country of origin, based on things like releasability, and
Sure.
also based on things like time of day, risky behavior, and how you're approaching it. And that all ties to how we start with identity, but move into that zero trust realm as a data management solution.
Yeah, sort of a way of getting past what Colonel Gerber mentioned and the idea of hand passing things, because that's the only way to cross certain membranes among organizations. Jay Bonsey from the Air Force, does that sound like what it is you're driving at?
Yeah, we have a lot of really interesting challenges around data tagging, with secret releasable data being a very practical example of this. And as we think about deploying enterprise services, we have to think about how data gets generated from various operational activities, whether or not it's analysts, whether or not it's a sensor and something that's automated, and what the enterprise custody of that data is, and how that gets delivered to how we generate effects from that data. And there are cultural elements around, it's okay to mark things as releasable on the one end, that we have to really that's a very large change in our operational communities, all the way through towards the data fabric services that we need to have. And here's how we have the custody of these attributes. Here's how we standardize them. Here is the identity in which that we associate with those, and then how we adjudicate access to that in a zero trust environment. And so we're really thinking through in the Air Force, a lot of the designs, our CDAO teams are thinking through a lot of that, and we're preparing to get those enterprise architectures together so that we can really start to vet it with our software factories and our other partners, and some of our major clarifying operational use cases for what we need to get done in 23. So it's spot on for really, it's just a very practical example of data tagging and how that relates to attributes and identity.
All right. So we have that need to integrate attributes and tags and so forth, and provenance of data, origin of data. Drew of DISA, is there a way to turn all that into a service?
There is. I'm sure there is. But honestly, from kind of to what Jay's outlining as a problem, it's not really a technology issue as much as it is a culture issue of how do you approach being a data custodian? How do you tag data appropriately? How do you just catalog and know what data it is that you have, right? I mean, we can put in all of the solutions to automate how you tag data, but if fundamentally you don't have a strategy for how you are going to tag that data, the tool will just sit there and gather dust. So it's really, talking of an end-to-end change on how we do business to include heavily the people process side of things. From a tools perspective, with data tagging, the data rights management, data loss prevention, all of that's been around for quite a while. It's just getting to how do we as a DoD make sense of all the data that we have, and then put together a consolidated strategy to talk about, well, if I tag something a certain way, and then, Jay tags it a different way, how is it then when we exchange data, then there's an automated process to say, Jay has access to this data when it's tagged differently. So how do we have a consolidated approach as a department to how we are going to tag data? That way, no matter how we pass data within DoD systems or external to mission partners, how do those tags maintain with that data, and then bring along with it the access controls for the identities for other users?
It almost sounds like a project about 25 years ago when the DoD attempted to identify all of their possible data elements in a way to try to bring it. I think they got to 12,000 and gave up. And so we're on to a different era now. Colonel Gerber.
And I'm not, I'm not at all trying to downplay the amount of effort that this would require. It is a huge thing, but for us, we have done in the past where we just think technology will fix this. This is definitely an area where it will not.
Okay, so where technology can come in, Colonel Gerber, what are you looking at in terms of how to architect a way of getting through all of this?
A lot of that's given to me to execute vice, my design, but I would come back to some comments that our colleagues have made up until now, which is in some ways you have to design things that default to either a more open data architecture, or more importantly, for example, as we describe releasability, it defaults to releasability and forces you to go through the process of making it harder for other people to access vice easier. Right now, I would say the people and the process part of this tends to default back to keeping the data tightly contained and not easily disseminatable. On the other hand, if you created environments and architectures that defaulted to max releasability because you fell back to this ICAM idea of zero trust in the future, then you find yourself in an environment where you're going to start to change people's behaviors through the technology that they're using. Easier said than done. But I think that as everybody's already talked about, it's the direction things are going. And the final point that I'd offer with that is while we might have 12,000 different data streams, we probably need to start with some of the more critical ones that are absolutely essential for the role that the military does with its partners, with industry. Focus on those, and then it can expand outwards. Targeting data, sensor data, those types of things immediately come to mind.
And Commander White?
I think when you consider the enormity of the problem in a centralized approach, you quickly get to the point where it's uncontrollable, it's unmanageable. And I'd say I would challenge that we need to find a democratized approach where we can all bring our solution to the table. And I sort of see a future where we are creating dynamic data mappings between organizations and really curating the map between organizations to allow us to communicate freely. And of course, the federal government already has a standard of data out there, right? The CUI designation, the register is a very good starting point for certainly some more sensitive unclassified information. We already have that kind of standardization in the classified domain as well. And I agree with what Colonel Gerber said. Should we fail open or should we fail closed? And I think that typically depends on what the sensitivity of that information is. So if we're talking about relatively open or public data, we should probably fail open and accept that risk, because the benefit to usability and accessibility is far greater than the loss of information that could potentially happen. And that all goes back to the data tagging and classification scheme as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is one of the fundamental thoughts behind this very large effort that everybody has a little piece of, that we mentioned at the beginning, which is JADC2 would somehow, there will be not a single JADC2, or JADC2 will be an umbrella for various implementations particular to each armed services. And that seems like the way we're going. So there's always going to be translation, always going to be kind of crossing barriers, even manually at some point. But it sounds like we're getting closer to an idea of at least integration of all of this data and attributes, et cetera, within a given enterprise. Fair to say? Who wants to take the last word on this?
Tom, if I may, I'd just like to underscore to that point something that Colonel Gerber had mentioned about starting with those data streams that are most critical to the mission. I think if you asked any one of us on the panel, if your house is on fire, what are the 3 things you're going to grab on your way out the door? It wouldn't take any of us much thought to kind of come up with that list. We know what's critical to us for our physical assets. We don't often spend enough time thinking about our digital assets, our digital data streams, and how they impact the mission. And that's what JADC2 is all about, using data, sharing data to affect mission objectives. But key to that is really understanding and prioritizing which of those digital assets are those break glass in case of fire, I'm going to grab these and run kind of services.
All right, Jay, you look like you're nodding in assent there.
Yeah, no, and that is, for us here at the Air Force, we have the Secretary's operational imperatives, and those are meant to be really clarifying about, if we should be focusing our limited resources, we need to be focusing our attention, we need to be focusing, the whole of the kind of the wheels of the .mil PF framework. Where do we need to be focused on? And we have identified 7 kind of key areas where that's at, and they've been talked about in various public places. But to that end, when you distill that down to actual operational outcomes, it really helps you figure out, okay, we're going to build this infrastructure in service of this problem, but then it has to be this generalizable way. And so the way in which we're thinking about the enterprise is as a scaling function for the way that some of the edge areas or in some of our theaters are going to start going after those clarifying use cases, right? And then using our sort of enterprise sustainment and kind of cost control measures to really to build on the back of that and make it sustainable and enduring. And so we're kind of embracing that the house is on fire analogy that that John used, and really thinking, okay, we know what those things that we're going to grab are, and let's rearrange, really, to the credit of the Secretary, rearrange everything to really focus on those items.
Well, I guess in the military context, if the house isn't on fire, you always consider it being surrounded by matches. So you've got to be ready. And that's where we get to the most critical data elements of all. I wish we had more time. We are at the close. I'd like to thank today's guests, Jay Bonsi, the Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force, Commander Jonathan White, Cloud and Data Branch Chief, U.S. Coast Guard, Colonel Ray Gerber, the Assistant Chief of Staff, G6, G39 for the Pacific Marine Forces. Drew Malloy is the Cybersecurity and Analytics Technical Directorate team member from Defense Information Systems Agency, and John Salen, the Director of Cyber Solutions for Defense at GDIT. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. And once again, please remember to look in this space in the weeks ahead. We'll be covering the second in our series on mission partner environments. And beyond that, we'll be getting to the 5G topic in the months ahead. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search GDIT.
On behalf of GDIT, thank you for joining us. The archive session will be available shortly. If you want to qualify for continuing education credit, you'll receive an email with your training certificate. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.